Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the Gurnee Village Board Committee of the Whole, November 27th, 2017. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Roll call. Andy?
Thorstenson.
Here.
Jacobs.
Here.
Ross.
Here.
Garner.
Here.
Balmus.
Present.
Hood.
Here.
6 present.
All right, this is informal tonight, just discussion. First item, I think we can skip because I've decided we're not going to have any snow this year. No snow. I cannot handle it on my commute. I cannot. I'm petrified. I've already been grilling David about ways to keep from sliding on the highway. He said drive slower. I don't know if that's an option. But anyways, Jake is going to tell us what he is going to do to make sure that snow and ice does not impede our commutes. Good evening.
All right, so I guess it's been some time since we did a presentation on our snow and ice control operations and our snow and ice plan. My plan tonight is just to keep it kind of informal, kind of go over the basics of our plan, kind of put together some data that we've been collecting as far as our operations over the past few years and let you know what kind of progress we've been making. Certainly if you guys have any questions at any point, feel free to stop me and I'll defer to Tom. Yeah. Okay. First slide here, it's snow season overviews. So we've collected data, or at least I was able to find data that goes back to 07, 08, and that is the year at which things changed after that, basically. So in 08, 09, that's when Tom started, and that is when we started making some significant improvements to our equipment. We brought in our liquid de-icing, so we had also computerized spreader systems installed on all the trucks. So what you kind of see here is sort of a progression of by year, how many events we've had, what the snow accumulations was, the amount of salt that we've used. So for instance, in 07, 08, which was a busy year, but we used just short of 7,000 tons of salt. And our averages since then have been somewhere closer to about 2,500 tons. And I think with considerably better results. Historically, our labor costs since that time, they've remained pretty flat. I mean, we've had a couple years where they bumped up. 13, 14 looked like a bit of an anomaly. That can be a few different things. It could be depending on whether the snow fell on a Saturday or Sunday, or whether the snow was falling during the day, so we had to cruise out for longer periods of time. There's a lot of variables that go into what a storm might cost us, or what our snow and ice control costs, either by the inch or by the storm. And but I think what we've seen is pretty level. I think our lowest was somewhere around $3,300 an inch, and it did spike in 13, 14, up over 5,000. But basically, we've been right at or just below $4,000 an inch, for the last 8 years, 9 years. The darker blue lines at 15, 16, and 16, 17, that represents some changes that we made to the way we calculate labor in the last couple of years, including benefit rates. So I think those are more accurate numbers than perhaps what they had been before. That represents about a 20% increase in labor. And also, because we now have the CityWorks program, we're allowed to track all of our costs to a storm. So ancillary operations such as sidewalks, push back on a couple days to follow the storm. We now track all of that back to our snow and ice control operations. So we're getting what I think is a more true cost going forward. So the next time we do this presentation, we'll probably be showing you all those numbers, and I think they'll actually represent more of a true cost. Certainly, one of the big drivers of cost as far as our snow and ice control operations is the cost of salt per ton. We certainly had a huge spike in 2008 and 2009, and that was generally relating to a lot of flooding that they had. not only on the Mississippi River, which made it harder for the barges to get here, but also in the mines, I guess, were also flooded, so they could not mine the salt. So you see there was a huge spike in cost right there. And since that time, they've really sort of leveled back into, I think the average, when I averaged it out, was about $60.50 a ton since that time. So, you know, one of the major things that we've seen since we've added the computerized spreading systems in the trucks, and we've gone to pre-treating the salt as it comes off the trucks, is we've been able to really greatly reduce the amount of salt that we put down per inch of snow. So I was able to compile data that went all the way back to 1999 through 2008. So that's pre-spreader control systems and liquid pre-treating, and we were averaging about 87 tons per inch of salt. And at the time since then, we're doing about 52 tons of salt per inch of snow. So if you kind of take that methodology and you sort of lay it out over the number of inches of snow we've had since we put the spreader control systems in, you know, we estimate that our salt savings would probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of 15,000 tons, maybe 16,000 tons, somewhere in that neighborhood. And if we multiply that out by the average cost of salt since that time, we're looking at about $950,000 that we did not spend on salt since we put these systems in place.
That's almost $1 million over a decade. It's very significant.
It's pretty substantial.
Yeah.
You know, I don't pretend that the methodology is 100%. I did averages because there are a lot of, like I said, there are so many variables that go into this. But, I mean, the numbers are there. And, you know, just to give you an idea, that would be 3 complete dome full of salt that we did not put down on the roads and into the environment. So I would say, you know, by and large, you know, we've changed a little bit in the way we've also been running our operations. You know, we're not looking for that, you know, 100% snow-free right off the bat. You know, so there has been a little bit of change also in the way that our operations have worked, and you know, so we're happy with, you know, the snow melting over the course of an hour or two rather than instantly, you know, melted roads. So, but I think all that, you know, if you put it all together, I think that we can definitely say that there's been a real improvement, I think, in our overall operations, and certainly in the cost and what we've done. So generally speaking, you know, our materials, we rely primarily on granular salt. That's our primary ice melter. On hand this year, we've got about 4,500 tons, so the dome is as full as we can make it. We have got we have a very large bin also outside of the dome that's also under roof. We have some additional salt there. This year we have on contract another 1,200 tons through the Lake County bid. So that means that this year, if it was a really terrible winter, we've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,700 tons available to us if we should need it. That would have to be a very busy winter. So I think if you go back and look, the most salt that we've used was in 2014. That was year we had 38 runs. Okay, we had 38 runs and we used about just over 4,000 tons of salt. So we're sitting really good. It's nice to have the dome that we have. It's nice to have that if we manage it properly, we start the season with, generally speaking, about a whole season's worth of salt, sometimes more. That gives us a cushion. That allows us to sort of, you know, play the good years and the bad years, and hopefully if we catch another year where we have really high salt, you know, prices, we can kind of cushion that with what we have in the dome. So I'd say that's a real benefit that we have here in this community that a lot of other places don't have. We do also pre-mix our salt with our liquid de-icing product, which at this point is called beet heat. That's basically a bunch of different types of chloride: sodium chloride, calcium chloride, magnesium chloride, and potassium chloride. And then there's also an ag product, which is actually sugar molasses, and all of that sort of blended together. We premix that with our salt at about 5 to 10 gallons per ton for the trucks that do not have spreader control systems on them. That's primarily the ones that we use in the cul-de-sacs and the smaller trucks. So all the salt that comes off our trucks in some fashion or another is being pre-treated with a liquid de-icer. That really boosts it. It allows us to put down less salt. It also reduces the scatter once it hits the roads. So it's really allowing us to kind of maximize where we're putting the salt and getting the best results that we are for the amount of salt that we're putting down. And so just to give you an idea, a typical storm, we will put down about 300 pounds of salt per lane mile. So, I mean, if you can, that is really a small amount. If you think about a mile of roadway, you know, that'd be like 6 50-pound bags. So we're getting really good action out of that, and I think our results are pretty good. We also have the ability to do anti-icing. We have a couple of trucks that are set up with sprayers, so that if we decide to go out and do some pre-treating of the roadways, if we know there's a storm coming in, we can do that. I think we've had some mixed results with that. I think it's something that definitely is good to have in your toolbox, especially when the salt prices are very high. But I think what we've seen, especially since we switched over to the product that we're using, the liquid de-icer, it is a little more expensive than the product we were using before. We're able to put it down at lower rates, so it does pretty well cost out. But to take it anti-icing would be fairly expensive. And there's also, I think there's places where it works really good. If you had a lot of bridge decks in town, very busy intersections, it might make sense to do that. But for the way that our snow and ice control plan works in the neighborhoods, I'm not sure it's the best use of our product and our money at this point. But it is something that it's something that we have available to us. It is something that we continue to look at and see if there'll be a time when that makes sense to do again. And then again, our average salt usage, somewhere around 2,500 tons a year. So just kind of overrun what we're running now. When I first started there, we had a very different plow fleet than what we have right now. We had one wing truck here, and we had everything else was 5 yards, 10 yards, and 1 tons. And we have really switched it around to rely on the 5 yards as our true workhorse out there. Every truck that we have in the fleet now, just about, that we're putting out on the mainline routes has got a wing. They all have got at least 200 gallons of liquid tanks on them. They all have spreader control systems. I mean, these things are a dream to drive, honestly. I mean, which is what you want, because if you're going to be out there for sometimes 14 hours, I'm telling you, it was a rough ride on some of them old trucks, and we got a couple of them still. But the technology has really come along to the point where what we're finding is we can be much more efficient with the trucks that we have in the fleet now than what we used to run. And I'll kind of go through that a little bit on the plan. But the 5 yards, we have a total of 15, but we're putting 14 of them out right now, so we have one spare. The 10 yards, we also have one spare of those. The ones that are the spares, frankly, are not the parade trucks. So our backup trucks are backups for a reason. We hope not to have to use them. And with the fleet that we have right now, we have had, I would say, a pretty good run here the last couple of years of keeping our primary trucks on the road. Certainly our vehicle maintenance division has done a good job with that. And I think having just the newer trucks that we've had, I think the investment is paying off in less breakdowns and more time with the trucks on the road. So that's been good. Support equipment, we have a variety of things available to us should the snow get really deep or as, the operation changes. We do have 2 loaders. This year we invested in a 14-foot push plow to assist with parking lot operations. And if we ever had to, we could certainly take it out and do cul-de-sacs, I think, pretty well with that. We utilize the larger machines also outside of the yard to push back corners or to dig corners out as the snow gets deep. And then we have got skid steers, and last year we also purchased a mini loader, primarily to do sidewalks with. Again, these have got a variety of other attachments and use not just during snow, but around the year. The mini loader specifically we purchased because it has got a very narrow footprint, so we're able to more efficiently do the sidewalks on the east side of town, which seemed to be a concern and something that we wanted to provide service back to that area. When we upgraded our skid steers a couple of years ago, we went from a smaller machine to a larger machine, and they no longer fit on those narrow sidewalks. So the footprint of that mini loader it's one of the most narrow machines out there, and it really does a great job with our sidewalks. Honestly, far more efficient, I think, than the skid steers. So that's been a very good investment. It's allowed us to really put service back into the east side of town here, so we're not able to, not just in front of the schools, but all the way down 132, even on Old Grand, where we sort of abandoned that several years ago, where we were doing more damage with the machine we had than we were really getting the snow clear. So, I guess I'm like everybody else, or maybe not like everybody else. In the winter, I rely on 3 or 4 different internet sites. I'm always checking the weather. I watch the news when I can, and for me, it's kind of taking averages. There's no secret to this, really. We get our weather information from the same places most everybody else does. We do pay for an upgraded system, which I have access to on my phone and at home. So usually I'll check that before bed and see how it's going. Primarily, the other weather information I have is outside my front window. So our snow and ice control staffing at Public Works, we have the Director of Public Works, who has a very important function on a day-to-day basis, especially during snow and ice control. And we have 3 supervisors, myself, the utility supervisor, and the vehicle maintenance supervisor. Our roles primarily are as either snow boss or as fill-in drivers. We have 23 maintenance workers, but 2 of them are currently on extended medical leave. And then we have 3 mechanics. So we have 22 trucks at the road during an ordinary storm on 11 designated routes. So that means we're putting 22 drivers out there. The mechanics cover the parking lots and breakdowns, and then the supervisors typically will cover for absent drivers, and then there's a snow boss usually in the office sort of overseeing the operation. So typically that's me. Sometimes it's Tom. Sometimes it's the other supervisor. You just never really know how a storm is going to go, but that's sort of how we try to do it. So the route assignments here, the names probably don't matter that much. I think what's sort of changed about this over the years is that we've got 11 routes, and we basically used to run a large truck and a small truck on each route, and then we had a couple of additional small trucks that we would put out on some of the routes. So what we ended up with was a big truck and a small truck, and the big truck would only do the big roads, and the small truck would only do the dead ends and the cul-de-sacs, and that really hampered our ability to sort of, if we had a breakdown, service the entire route. So now what we have, and I think, all the W's you see up there under the trucks, those are all the wing-equipped trucks, so you can see that we have primarily those out there. We are using the 5 yards now in the cul-de-sacs and on the dead ends where we didn't used to do that. The trucks that we have now have got a pretty tight turning radius. The wings can be extended in and out so that in very tight areas we can still get them in there. We're allowed actually, the way we do it now, we typically will reverse plow around the cul-de-sac island to try and reduce the amount of snow that we're sending out into the driveways. I don't pretend that that's a perfect deal. There's still going to be snow no matter what you do that's going to go out into the driveways, but I believe that by doing it this way we have reduced pretty significantly the amount of snow that we're putting into the driveways around the cul-de-sac islands. So there is our total route. It's a village map, and then so there's 11 different routes there. What we've done also with these, with the larger trucks, the 10-yard trucks, is we've actually taken and identified on the routes what we would consider to be primary roads. So those are the feeder roads, and we've actually, in the case of like routes 8, 11, and 9, so that's everything west of Hunt Club Road, we have selected the primary roads that the 10-yard truck actually will do roads in all 3 of those routes. They take on about double the lane miles of what the other trucks do, but at the same time, their routes are pretty much a straight shot. You know, they put the plows down and they go. So like Almond Road, Data Drive, and this particular one, Stonebrook, those mainline roads, we have a truck that's basically designated just to those mainline roads, and that allows them to really focus on that while the other trucks are on the more interior parts of the neighborhood. We try to do now, unlike what we used to do, where the big truck would sort of drive by the cul-de-sac, now the truck that's assigned to the interior neighborhoods is actually doing not only the secondary road, but they're also actually going into the cul-de-sacs as they get there. So I think we're making more efficient use of the, there's a pattern that we set up typically for these routes. So basically when they get to a cul-de-sac, instead of passing it up, they're actually turning into the cul-de-sac. With the wings on the trucks, they can kind of sweep the radiuses, so we're actually pushing back in less spots than we used to, so we're creating less snow piles on the corners than we used to. And I think that, as compared to how we used to do it, I think that this is basically the most efficient use of our trucks and our drivers out there in the routes. So this is just a close-up of routes 8, 9, and 11, just to kind of reinforce what I was talking about. What we used to do is split up a big truck and a small truck on all 3 of these. So this 3 routes used to be serviced by 6 trucks, and now we're currently doing it with 5, and I think with better results, honestly. The blue roads, that's primarily a Data, Bittersweet, Almond, Stonebrook, and then just some bigger loops on there that we did just to sort of even out the lane miles. But those blue roads, those are on all 3 routes, and that was one truck that is doing those. And then we have sort of geographically the other areas are split up between 3 other 5-yards. So the green, the red, and the purple are all 5-yard routes. And you can see that the same truck that's doing the through streets there is also doing all the cul-de-sacs in those neighborhoods. And then we did last year, we added in a small truck to kind of assist and sort of break this out. I went through a couple of years ago and really kind of we had not really looked at the individual routes, the amount of lane miles that were on them and how we were doing them. And so I kind of went back through and sort of tried to even them out so that each truck has got a pretty similar amount of lane miles. I would say we average about 5 lane miles, between 5 and 6 lane miles on the secondary routes. Most of the 10-yard routes or primary routes are somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 lane miles. And then, the support trucks that we have out there doing the cul-de-sacs, they have a considerably less number of lane miles, but the cul-de-sacs do admittedly take considerably more time. So a typical call-out scenario, snow ops will be initiated by the snow boss or by police dispatch. And that, for me, when I'm the snow boss, which is most of the time, if I know that snow is forecasted, depending on how much is forecasted, I'll just set my alarm for about 2 or 3 in the morning, look out my front window and see if it's snowing. And if it is snowing, at that point, I'll check the radar, see how things are going, check the forecast, and then typically we'll initiate a snow call. So we have a single crew that we put on the road. We have basically just enough drivers to fill the trucks. So since we can't really run a 24-hour operation with that, what we try to do is keep our operational hours for snow and ice control between the hours of about 3 a.m. and 8 p.m. And that allows our drivers to, at the end of the day, hopefully go home and get a little bit of sleep before we have to maybe do it again the next day. There certainly are scenarios where we might start earlier or stay later, depending on You know, if the snow is about to end, or if it's not, or if there's a particularly heavy snow. Well, what we're generally trying to do in the morning hours is at least get through once on all the roads before the beginning of rush hour. You know, we like to consider that at about 7 a.m. That's when the buses seem to be heaviest out there. So, you know, my goal, or our goal as a group, really is to get in and get on the roads and get everything taken care of at least once before 7 a.m. and then throughout the day. And we figure that by 8 p.m. what we've really generally noticed is traffic seems to calm down after that point. So we figure that's a fair time to sort of call it quits for the evening if we don't think we can finish it. Admittedly, snow operations are tough on the drivers. We can work 14, 16 hours a day and go home for a 4 or 5 hour period and be expected to do that the next day. So there are times when, you know, we run the crews really hard, and we don't really, as a community, have too much choice in that because we don't have a lot of. I mean, we're not deep on manpower. I think that we put together a good crew, and I think that by trying to keep the operational hours the way we do, you know, we're being as responsible as we can. But that does put us sometimes in a tough spot. I'll just throw out a scenario. Last year, we were in the night before. We came in the morning, and we worked. It was still snowing, but the forecast at the time was actually calling for more snow in the night and then overnight the next morning. So I cut the crew loose earlier than what I might have done, hoping that they would get some time in between, you know, one call to the next. And the reality is it kept snowing that morning, and the road conditions kind of deteriorated a bit. That's just a tough call. I didn't, you know, and so there are times, and, you know, there's going to be times where, you know, the snow boss may be making calls that might allow the roads to deteriorate a bit, but what I'm trying to do in some cases is to save the crew for that next storm that might be forecasted, and the problem with forecasts is sometimes it comes true and sometimes it doesn't. So there's a lot of decisions that have to be made by the person who's running the operation, and you know, our goal is to keep the roads as clear as we can, but it's also to look ahead to the next storm and see how things are going. So you know, if there's ever any questions you guys have about why we're out or why we're not, give me a buzz. I mean, there's usually a reason, even if it's a bad one, why I did something.
You're doing a great job, Jake.
Well, that's fine.
You know, no win, and I will gladly take those phone calls and back you up.
That's fine.
But yeah, it's a no-win. Usually the first call I get is the last person on the route, and they're the first ones to call. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think when we're doing a better job now of communicating with our residents what the routes are, what the process is, how many trucks we have. And yes, you have to juggle things, and you've got to look ahead 3-4 days, not just the morning commutes. So
right.
You're doing a good job, and you have our support.
Well, no, I appreciate that. I'm just trying to get it. I just would like everybody to understand that, you know, there are a lot of things that go into this that make it really difficult. And there are times when I'm sitting at home and I'm like, man, I wish that hadn't gone the way it went. But sometimes it does. And, you know, if we could run a 24-hour operation, it'd be different. But there's a lot of communities that don't, and a lot of us get it put in that same spot. So, you know, I just like to get that out there. Operations typically for us, they'll cease when the roads are clear or when conditions are forecast to improve. You know, like I said, there may be breaks in between when you know, we start. And, you know, we may have to stop, you know, to get the guys off the road for a while and then put them back out. But basically, our goal is, you know, clear roads. You know, the other thing that I've noticed over the past couple of years, and part of this is just sort of our philosophy on salt usage, I guess. We've had storms or conditions where it was so cold that the salt by itself really wasn't working at the rates that we would typically put it down. So we had conditions like where the roads looked, I would say, like condition 1. They were clear. They were very passable. They were still slippery. There was honestly, in most of those cases, a pretty good amount of product that was on the road, but the conditions were so cold that it was not working. Now, you can salt it heavily enough to get that to melt off, but for the most part, I think that, you know, if the roads are in condition one for a day or two because we're in extreme cold temperatures. I'm of the opinion that that's something that's workable out there for the community to kind of deal with. What we find is as soon as the sun pops out or as soon as the conditions raise, not only does it melt off pretty quick, but you can actually see the salt, the residual salt that was on the roadbed the whole time. So, I mean, that's something that we can certainly talk about, or we can kick around. That's how we're running, the operation now. Just sort of trying to keep, I think, trying to be both economically conscious and environmentally conscious with our salt usage. I don't know that for most of the neighborhoods it makes sense to have a zero snow policy on the roadways. That's certainly something we can talk about, but
That's good information to share with Jack, though, and to get on social media that the roads have been plowed, there's salt on them, but it's too cold for the salt to
Yeah.
optimally work.
I
So
think we've tried to relay
please slow
that.
down. David laughs at that one. But, I think people, again, residents, once they understand, it's not that we're ignoring the road. We've done the road. We put salt, a reasonable amount of salt down, but it's cold.
yeah.
So-
And I find too, more and more when we get calls into Public Works that start as complaints, it's really just they don't fully understand that there's sort of a method to what we're doing out there, and that in most cases I find that as we talk to the citizens about what we're doing and why we're doing it, they seem to actually be on board with it. It's just that I don't,
It's a mystery.
short of us getting the information out there,
It's a big mystery how we do it and,
Yeah.
and the science behind it and what's involved. And we've done a great job, and we're going to continue to, tidbits like that would be great information to push out and let it get spread. And people do appreciate what you're doing once they understand it.
No, I think so. I mean, we do get plenty of compliments to go along with the other ones. So sidewalks, we did make some changes to the route this year, sort of on a more permanent basis. Last year we added in just to kind of see how it would go. We're now doing a Route 132 from 21 all the way east to Lawrence. I'm not entirely sure how that's going to go with that bridge project over there, whether that sidewalk's going to be all the way open or not, but maybe short of that, we'll continue to do that area. We added Old Plain Road all the way down to the Country Trails neighborhood. We added back in all of Old Grand Avenue. And, for the most part, that small machine kind of goes through those areas without any real trouble. We've had to do a little bit of additional tree trimming on the route just to make sure that machine is a little taller than the other one. But by and large, it makes it all over all the narrow walks, all the bridge crossings that we have. And then we're still using our V-plows and the snow blowers on the skid steers on the walks out west, so like along Almond Road. And then along Washington, we're doing from Hunt Club Road all the way to Hillview. So typically I would say the sidewalks at this point take us a better part of a day to follow up. As long as the snow has stopped, we can usually get out there pretty quick. Certainly we've had issues in the past with the machines breaking down, but we have upgraded some of that equipment as well, and I think they have become considerably more reliable than they were in the past. So I would expect that we'll continue to be able to do this pretty well. We can certainly look at adding additional sidewalks in. I'm hesitant to go back to doing all that we used to do, partially because there hasn't really been much call for it. So, I think it makes sense to sort of evaluate how many requests we're getting for any specific area, and how much time would be involved in doing it. But on a typical snowfall, we can respond pretty quickly to these. If we continue to add them in, that'll slow it down a bit. But I don't have a problem with that. But if we're getting snow that happens day after day after day, there's going to be maybe days or even weeks where the sidewalks don't get done because they're just they're a much lower priority. They have to be taken care of once all the other snow operations are complete. So on the horizon, The 5-yard trucks in the cul-de-sacs and the spreader control systems are all fantastic. They do, however, also need, there's a higher level of training that has to happen to get the drivers to be efficient with them. So that's something that we're continuing to work on, not only the drivers that we have, but as our personnel, if they retire or something like that, and we have to bring someone else in. There is a learning curve to doing this. It does take time to become efficient with it. So it becomes a process. I would say you're probably looking at 1 to 2 seasons with a driver and a truck on a new route before they really get a good firm grasp of it. And I think that would be the situation just about anywhere, but in some cases I think it is noticeable if we go from a driver who has a lot of training to a driver that's being put fresh on the route. So we've had multiple times where a citizen will call in and ask what's going on this year, and we have to kind of explain to them we're breaking in a new guy, and bear with us. But all in all of the technology is fantastic, but it's no longer just a quick, easy, here's the 2 levers you need to know and go for it. There's really a science to it and an art to it. And then we'll continue to research, ways to keep our salt usage low. The liquid product we're using now is something that we found a couple years back, and it really seems to be doing a better job than what we had been using before. So, as new products come on the market, we're always looking to see if there's something that we can, help to make our operation better. And then we are continuing to use our Sidewalks program to track our snow and ice control operations and keep all of our costs in there. So I think what we're going to find as we go forward is, like I said before, the tracking of our costs, our equipment, are going to be much more apples to apples as we go forward than what we've got, the old data that we have. I mean, I was going through handwritten sheets from, I can't even tell you really how accurate all that information is, but that's what we had. So, but going forward, it's going to be a much nicer way. Our ability to report off of that and manipulate the data that we've been putting in there has been much improved over the last 2 years, and I expect that's even going to get better as we go forward. So it's snow and ice in a nutshell. Do you have any questions?
Very important operation that everybody depends on. So I know we've made huge progress, and every year we get fewer calls. And
I hope so.
I think a lot of it's been education. We've done a better job. People know where to find stuff. They know the map. They can see where their route is. So, and we're going to continue to tweet and post and all that. I like some of those tidbits you had. Questions from the trustees? Karen?
Does Lake County DOT keep up to pace with us since they're cutting through some of our town? And do you see that like in accident reports if they're not, as well as complaints?
So I would say most of the complaints we get are not really on Lake County DOT roads. They typically are on state roads. IDOT has been sort of hit and miss the last couple of years as far as their plowing. I've spoken to the guy at the state garage. I do not envy him his situation. He's responsible for a lot of lane miles with a very small crew, and his equipment is not as good as ours.
How did it work out last year when the county took over some of the state routes?
It was improved. The county runs a very nice snow and ice operation. They're out there before they can run a 24-hour operation, so, their roads are usually cleared or being cleared even before we're out. Do you know how they made out on money? Like what the state paid them? Did it cover their costs? No, I don't have any idea how that. I would imagine that the state reimbursement rate was probably inadequate, but
that's more
when we
service level than it is.
Yeah, we had looked at Grand Avenue, and they gave you a third of what it would actually cost you to do.
Yeah, the problem with that, or the issue with that, if you were going to take on an operation like that, is you really then have to staff that 24 hours a day, and you really have to be prepared to put additional trucks out there.
Bigger trucks. And
it really becomes an entirely stepped up operation from what we're running right now, which, it would require a lot of
I actually was thinking that the
investment.
county would do Grand Avenue.
That would be nice, because that's the road I have to come in on, so.
You know, if the state doesn't get their act together better on Grand Avenue, it may be something to see if the county is looking at expanding that program, not telling them it's grand, but just seeing how they made out, see what you can find out, how they made out, if they thought it was worth it, and are they looking to expand it? Greg?
I personally don't have any problem driving on condition 1 through 4. But I can see how some people would prefer 4 over condition 1.
Absolutely.
My question is the village in any way liable? Maybe a question for Brian Winter, but if an accident occurs under condition 1,
I think the
I mean,
ticket
I
would
don't
be,
know.
you're driving too fast for conditions.
Yeah.
No, it'd be just like if it's raining or something. And
well,
there's an
you know, I'm
accident.
just trying to protect the village.
Yeah,
I mean,
no.
you see snow on the road, you didn't plow, and you know how it goes after that.
Mm-hmm.
They make a phone
Well,
call.
the thing, we
Yeah.
did plow with condition 1. It's just
It's
the
just-
cold is keeping the snow from melting.
You
The
know,
other
it's-
question is along the same line with some of the kids have to walk to school with sidewalks. And, you know, I've made complaints over the years about Grand Avenue between First Street and Old Plain Road because it piles up there and some of the times I see the kids walking on Grand Avenue on the side, actually on the road. And the cars are going 50, 60 miles an hour sometimes on there, and it's icy. I was wondering if we're in any way liable. I know we have snow machines now, but can we be held liable in any way for that? I mean, it's a question we need to.
No, I mean, any pedestrian on a street, you know, it's up to the driver to avoid the pedestrian. But, you know, again, when we talk to the schools don't want kids walking. And we're trying to get them to communicate that more frequently and more often and get it to the parents. But no, any pedestrian walking in the street, whether there's snow or not, I think the same traffic laws would apply. I mean, you can't hit a pedestrian no matter what the conditions are, no matter where they're walking. So whether there's snow on the sidewalk or not.
But some of the kids they actually don't have bus service because they live so close.
If they're going to Gurnee 56, they all, even if they
The high
live a
school
half a
kids
block.
it's the high school kids.
High schools talked about setting up certain
Yeah.
spots in neighborhoods that might be a little further from their house to walk, but not as far as walking to school. So that is something that we've talked to the superintendent about over there.
Yeah, it's
Before
just
we
I
have
see
snow.
them walking,
Yeah.
and it's like a nightmare when you see
Yeah.
a kid walking in the street. And did you have a question?
Have you fixed that yet, Mr. Drake? Yes, please. Tom's on the school board. Orange
Hi,
County
Tom
High
Drake.
School.
I'm on the school board. We actually have a process, and I've learned more about this recently, where we can, within a certain radius of the school, identify conditions that you're highlighting, Greg, and we can get those identified as safety issues. I'm not sure if it has to be ongoing or if it could be seasonal, and then we would provide transportation to the kids that would be required to walk down that stretch of highway at that certain time.
That's great.
I was actually going to talk to the mayor because I know with the walkability study and some of the improvements that you're making, we might be able to remove some of those areas from our ongoing list. But there's a process that we have to identify those. It's handled by the principals from each of the campuses.
Okay, good.
Yeah, and just along those lines, and I know that was an area of concern. We did make what I would consider to be some pretty significant improvements to the walkway underneath the railroad viaduct there, so that we can get the machine in there. And now that we have that new machine, that section of sidewalk is done right after Old Plain Road. So we have moved that up on our priority. We were in what I would consider to be kind of a tough spot with the equipment that we had because it was too heavy for the bridge for starts, that pedestrian bridge. It was also too wide for the pedestrian bridge, and we just simply could not get that machine there. But I'm pretty confident that going forward, barring ongoing snowfalls, we should be able to have that cleared
Sure.
with, relative speed, so.
Good.
I just want to also thank you for the communication that we had earlier today about the bus pickup in Steeple Point. Appreciate it.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and again, it's another, just based on route design, there are areas where, the trucks are going to push back on the corners. It's just simply the most efficient way to do it. But, again, if you talk to residents or, even if you guys see areas where, it's a bus stop and we're having problems, we'll dispatch the loaders pretty quickly to clean those areas out and sort of move the snow if we need to, to open those locations back up. So I think we're seeing a lot less of that now with the wings and the route designs that we have, where we're actually not having to push back so many corners. But if there are locations where we're doing it, we'll do what we can to get those cleaned out as quick as we can. So,
Mike?
Yeah, this may not be a question for Jake, it may be more for Chief Woodside, but as a result of our improvements in snow removal during the snow events, have we seen a statistical improvement, meaning a decrease in motor vehicle accidents in the village over the last 8 to 9 years? Or is that something that we would need to go back and have a number cruncher look at this point?
Is that something that I could look at?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's something we need to spend a whole lot of time doing, but it'd be interesting to know. Thank you.
All right, well, again, we're just not going to have any snow this year. I'm going to wish it away, or pray it away, one of the two. Thank you very much.
you are welcome, Jake.
All right, and then we have
Brian and Jeff.
financial reports. So Jessica Fain is here. Brian's going to introduce it. So we have, is Jessica doing the police and fire report?
Yeah,
Oh,
I was just
okay.
gonna.
All right, so this is the first update we've had in a while. And I asked Brian specifically to put this on a committee of the whole. Our pensions are very, very important because our public safety officers don't have Social Security. So we have to protect it. It's an important investment for us. But we're also very, very responsible for the gap when their investments don't reach the 7% rate. It's up to them, and that's something that's very hard for us to budget. So we know what our contributions are, what the employees' contributions are, but based on how the pension board for police or fire handles their investments, we end up with the gap. And so it's something that we really all need to be paying very close attention to. So I did ask Brian to kind of give us an update. We've had some volatility and some swings in how the portfolios are invested and their diversification. So I thought it would be good for us to kind of start getting a little more astute about how our pensions are working. So, Brian, you're going to introduce, or Jessica?
Yeah, I just wanted to do a couple quick slides here. So this is really the third iteration of the multi-year forecast, and as part of that, I wanted to do a little pension presentation up front here, talk about some of the things, including a sensitivity analysis, rate of return, some of the things the mayor talked about there, and then we'll get into more of the financial sections of the forecast. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jessica to present the actuary reports for the police and fire pension funds for this year.
Perfect. Can everyone hear me okay? Well, thank you so much for having me tonight. I know that actuarial topics don't typically interest people. We're coming back from the holidays, so I appreciate that you were willing on a Monday at 7 p.m. to put up with me and let me go over the funds a little bit. Our actuary reports are a thrilling 40 pages front and back. And while I would love to go through every single one of those pages with everyone, I know that maybe that's not what everyone else would enjoy doing. So what we did is we pulled out the key results on both of those reports and combined them in a couple of slides. Now, this first slide is just a general overview of what the fund looked like as of the most recent fiscal year end. you'll see that the current recommended contribution, when you combine the fire and the police, is right under $4 million, coming in at $3,978,000. Now, this is a little bit more than a 2.5% increase than last year's recommended tax levy of $3,875,000. In just a moment, we'll touch on why there's an increase and what to expect going forward, but I did want to point out two other items. The first I want to point out is the fire population versus the police. Both funds currently have a similar amount of active members contributing. We have 54 for the fire and 57 for the police. However, you'll notice that fire only has about half as many people collecting benefits from the fund. So one of the things we're going to talk about is how that number is expected to change going forward as more people become eligible. The last item I wanted to point out on this page was something really positive for the year for both funds, and that was the funded percentage. You'll see that our fire funded percentage is right over 70%, and police is very close, coming in at 67.82. Or overall, taking a look at our funds as a whole, we're at 68.91. Now, we don't have last year's figures here, but I did look those up. And last year overall, we would have been around 66.07. So almost a 3% increase in our funded percentage from last year to this year. The next slide is going to help to explain why we had such a nice bump in our funded percentage. And it's because it was a really great year when it came to building our assets. We put in the recommended amount from the municipality. Our employees contribute a percentage of their paycheck, but you'll see that fourth line item down, return on investments, a really great year in the markets for both our funds. You'll see that in total, in investment earnings, we earned almost $6 million. Of course, we had to pay out benefit payments and administrative expenses, the operating costs for the fund. But overall, if you take a look at that bottom right-hand box, we had an increase in our assets of around $7.6 million. So when you consider that almost $6 million of that came from investment earnings, you can see what a great year it was for our different funds. Now you'll notice in fire we're paying out about $1 million in benefit payments. For police we're paying out about $2.1, or overall last year we paid out a little bit over $3 million. The next slide shows us though what's to occur in the near short term. In the next 5 years, because of the individuals becoming eligible to retire and collect a benefit, you'll see the amount being paid out in our fire fund is expected to more than double. Currently paying out $1 million, but in 5 years we're expected to pay out about $2.2. And then in 10 years it will actually have tripled as even more people become eligible, or paying out around $3.4. Our police as well is expected to increase in the next 5 to 10, of course not doubling or tripling, but you'll see that in 5 years we're expected to pay out about $3.37 for them, and in 10 years about $4.56. So fire really right now doesn't have nearly as many individuals collecting, but that's expected to change pretty soon. So right now paying out around that $3.2 million, but in 5 to 10 years paying out close to $8 million. So this is the reason why we don't recommend you put in $1 million in fire or $2 million into police. We recommend you put in more than that, because we're building up our assets to prepare for 5 or 10 years down the road when we're paying out a lot more in benefits. Now the next slide is going to explain why we had this increase of a little bit more than 2.5%. Most importantly for everyone is that very first line that says expected changes. It's really important to understand that the tax levy process is designed where every single year you should have an increase of around 3 to 4%. Every year you're going to be paying down a little bit more of that unfunded liability, and every year you're going to put in some additional dollars for your active members. They've earned another year of service, a little bit closer to retirement, they probably got a pay increase. The nice thing is that every year your active members are usually contributing about 3 to 4% more as well, because most likely they got some sort of pay increase from last year to this year. So for the current year, the expected increase for both of our funds was around $125,969. The next set of rows are all the behind-the-scenes moving lever that every single year could result in that final tax levy recommendation coming in a little bit higher or a little bit lower than our expected increase. You'll see for this year, we actually ended up coming in about $23,000 less than was expected. And I'll go through each item really quickly. The first is pay increases. Overall pay increases came in very close to what we had projected them to, just slightly under. What this means is that when we take this updated information, we're projecting pay at retirement and, of course, benefits at retirements for individuals. We're now projecting them to be just slightly less than we thought last year. You'll see that overall this creates a decrease in the tax levy of $50,924. If there's ever a year when pay increases come in slightly higher than what we had projected, you would see the opposite. You would see a little increase come through in your tax levy. The next item that can impact your levy is any population shifts. You actually had quite a few shifts. We had some shifts that caused increases. We hired people to our funds. We had an individual who retired, an individual who became disabled. But we also had some shifts that caused decreases. We had some individuals who terminated the fund, and unfortunately we did have a benefit recipient who passed away without a surviving spouse, so there's no longer that benefit payment going out. At the end of the day, when you combine these increases and decreases, you'll see the net impact is an overall decrease of $29,675. So depending on how your population shifts from one year to the next, you might see an additional increase or decrease in your tax levy. The next line item is assumption changes. So one that always makes people a little nervous because it's something that your actuary did a little different this year than the previous year. Over the last year, they released information on how you could create custom mortality tables for every single member of the fund. So depending on if the member is active, retired, disabled, terminated, or a spouse, depending on if they are male or female, and depending on their current age, they get their own individual custom table. Implementing this is one way that we can get a little bit closer in how we do our projections. Previously, we had used one single table that was a pretty good representation for all members of our fund. The nice thing is that when your assumptions and your tables are up to date, anytime something comes out that allows you to customize or get a little bit more specific, the impact is pretty minimal. You'll see the overall impact was an increase of $27,305, which is less than a 1% increase in our tax levy. So $27,000 sounds like a lot to me and probably to you as well, but when you think of a tax levy that's close to $4 million, you can see how it's a pretty minimal impact. The next line item is asset returns. Now, we just talked about how this past year was a really stellar year in the markets. So if I just told you markets did phenomenally, why in the world do we have an increase of $28,519 due to how the markets performed? If the markets did great, they earned more money, shouldn't we see a decrease in our tax levy the next year? Well, we know there's going to be great years in the markets. We're certainly hoping that there's going to be more years where we beat our 7% return assumption than we fall short of it. We never expect to get exactly 7%. What we're expecting is about half the time to beat it, half the time to fall short, so that long term we average out to that 7%. What we do when we do our tax levy calculation is we don't focus on what you earned last year. We take a look at your 5-year history. How have you earned on average over the past 5 years? When we take a look at a 5-year history, our police fund is lagging just slightly behind that 7%. They're averaging right now around 6.8%, so very close. For our fire fund, they're a little bit less than our 7% as well. They're coming in at, I believe, around 6% or a little bit under. But our fire fund has made a lot of changes over the past year to 2 years. They now have a new investment professional they've been working with for about 1.5 years. So the majority of that 5-year window is with the previous investment professional. And I did take a look at what their most recent one-year return was with the new investment professional. And last year they had a return of over 11%. So really positive outlook heading forward. And no pressure on the new investment professional. Sawyer Faldudo, I'm sure they'll just get 11% every year and we won't have to worry about it again. But that's why our fire fund was lagging a little bit more. It's really those previous years, not with their current investment professional. Now, the last piece of the puzzle can be a little bit of a headache. It's contributions into the fund. If we were to go back to that very first slide that showed what was recommended in our fund for the current year and last year, you would have seen last year's recommendation was around $3.8 million. But you would have been meeting around this time last year to discuss levying for that or finding those funds in your budget. It would have been in 2017 that you would have actually went out for those dollars, and it's very unlikely that you actually received those dollars in before that April 30th fiscal year end date. Instead, you probably collected those this summer into the fall. Maybe you're even still collecting some now. There's about a 1-year lag between when you have these discussions and you actually get the dollars. The dollars that the fund received last year isn't related to the discussions you had in December of 2016. They're most closely related to the discussions you would have had in December of 2015. So what I did is I looked up exactly what would have been recommended in December of 2015. For fire, it was recommended $1,700,217. And I compared this to what fire received in last year. They received $1,700,217 to the dime. For police, $1,945,216 was recommended, and they again received to the penny $1,945,216. So it's not that our funds are receiving less than they should have. In fact, when I take a look at your 5-year history, you have consistently put in exactly what's been requested over the past 5 years, except I believe 1 year, police or fire got $6 more. So I'm not sure who was the lucky duck that year that got $6 additional. But otherwise, it's been right to the penny.
Rounding error.
Here's the headache with the way we do tax levy reports, though. The Department of Insurance doesn't take into account that there's about a 1-year lag between when you get these numbers, you have these discussions, and the dollars actually hit the fund. Instead, they say on paper last year, you recommended around $3.8 million, and you didn't receive that full amount. Even though there's no way you could have possibly received it by April, you're just now collecting those dollars. So because on paper, it looks like that there's a shortfall, what you'll see is a little increase in your tax levy. For fire, it was very minimal, $1,685. And police would have saw an increase as well. However, the one piece of the pie that we never think of, because it never really changes, is employee contributions. They're pretty much set in stone, easy formula, it's just percentage of their salary. We did have 3 police officers who last year bought back prior service. So they had to contribute additional employee contributions in than we were expecting. So they actually offset that little increase we would have normally seen come through and created this very minor decrease of about $522. And at the end of the day, we have a very minimal increase of around $1,163 total related to this. But I really want everyone to understand that there's a difference between what's occurring in the real world, how they're actually being funded, versus what on paper it might look like. I never want someone to pick up this report and think, you aren't funding properly, you aren't putting in the full amount, what's going on, when in fact you have a really nice 5-year history of consistently putting in exactly what's requested. So when you add up all these behind-the-scenes moving parts, at the end of the day, instead of coming in $125,000 higher than last year, we came in around $102,000 higher. So what to expect going forward? Next year, if you're having budget discussions and you haven't received your exciting 40-page actuary report, a good placeholder figure is to take the current recommended levy and to increase it about 3 to 4%. Every year, it's expected to go up around 3%. However, you'll probably have an additional little bump due to that last item we talked about, the fact that there's a time lag in the tax levy, and it looks like on paper you're not putting in the full amount. And you'll also most likely have another little bump from market returns. Next year, we'll have a new 5-year window we're looking at, but unfortunately, really the key year that kind of had flat returns was that 2015-2016 year. So it'll probably still be part of our 5-year average and might still be bringing down our 5-year averaged return. So next year, just take current year's figure, increase it about 4%, and then wait for the exciting final results. The very last slide, we take all that information we just chatted about, and we simply translate it into how it looks if you were looking not at the tax levy, but the funded percentage. And the general rule of thumb is, if it makes your levy go up, it probably made your liability go up, so it probably made your funded percentage go down. So anytime you see an increase on the previous slide, you'll probably see a decrease on this slide. And that is it. That is the actuary process demystified for both our funds. Next year, it'll be the same exact thing. We'll have an expected amount, then we'll just take a look at how pay came in, how our population changed, any new exciting actuary studies we should incorporate, how's the new 5-year market look, returns appear, and then, of course, contributions in.
God, I hope that's on YouTube. That is like the best explanation I've ever heard of the pension and how you get to what we are, what the levy would be if we didn't pay it out of general fund and sales tax. That was excellent.
Well, thank you very much.
I can't believe somebody
find it
understands
exciting,
that so
hopefully
well.
y'all do now.
I am demystified.
Yeah.
I am clarified. And I just feel good all over. That was great.
Yeah, it was. So we're doing all right.
You are. I often get the question what the typical funded percentage is for most funds, and it's a little bit less than 40%. So the fact that both your funds are right there at the 70% mark, you're definitely ahead of the pack currently, but also you have this really great 5-year history of fully funding what your funds request. Not the statutory minimum. These amounts are based on a 100% funding target by 2040, not the minimum. So you're actually doing more than the minimum, and that's why you're seeing that improvement in your fund.
And some of that comes out of when we did the pension funding policy last year. Remember, we were looking at how we could be more conservative and things like that. Using the 100% target are exactly what we were looking to do. So, a couple other notes.
Wait, Tom, did you have a question?
Sorry.
I just had a question about our 7% to see what you thought about our choosing the assumption of 7%.
So unfortunately, this is where I pass the buck to those far more intelligent than me. As actuaries, what we do is we tell you what a reasonable range is for assumptions. It's based on studies that we see, different investment professionals projecting where markets will go, and then also the investment returns we're seeing people use. For funds of your size, we see a range anywhere from 6.5% to 7.25%. So being at 7%, you are closer to the upper end of the range, but it's definitely not unreasonable. Next time you guys get together, if the investment professionals are available, they're the ones that can give kind of their insight and intellect. That's what we pay in the big bucks for predicting where markets are heading. So right now, 7%, historically, you can actually see police has been achieving it. For fire, we do have a couple years where we missed the mark, but most recently, with our new investment professionals, really knocked it out of the water. It's not unreasonable for a fund of your size compared to what other funds are doing. It is in that reasonable range. The question becomes for you as a board, what sort of risk we want to take. The more aggressive we are with our investment returns, the greater the risk we have of falling short of it and having to make up for it later on. But the more conservative we are with our investment returns, if it turns out we don't need to be that conservative, unfortunately that money comes from somewhere. I'm sure you have to, maybe make different budgeting choices if you to use, say a 4% return, which is really outside the realm of what we're seeing people use. So you have to kind of weigh those different risks as a board, what's going to be, which one you're more comfortable with.
So we had been doing 7.5%. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I think we pulled it back to 7%. That was like $500,000.
We were at 7.5, and we pulled it down a quarter
So one of the things
Each
that,
couple
because
of-
we had
couple
talked about
years.
this, I think at the last forecast, actually, discussion. So one of the things we had Lauterbach and Amon do this year was a sensitivity analysis, and it's this sheet that was out at the tables there. So it would give us an idea if we did move the rate down 0.5%, what that would cost us annually, roughly. And so if you just look at the police pension side, you see columns A, B, and C. The contribution requirement kind of there in the middle of the page under 7% is 2.17, almost 2.17 million. If we lowered the assumption by 0.5%, that would increase to 2.6 million, so about $450,000 swing. If we lowered the assumed rate of return to 6%, that contribution would go to 3.1. So if you figure roughly $500,000 for a half a point there, and that's just on the police side. If you flip it over, you see the fire side follows roughly the same pattern, a little bit less dollars. Obviously, it's a smaller fund. So if you, in generalities, if you think if we lowered it 0.5%, it would cost us about $1 million between the two funds a year or so additional.
And that's why it's important to pay attention to this, because we're using 7, but if they never achieve 7, we're making up the difference. So, not that we're recommending, but we don't get any say in the investments, but we're the ones who make up the difference. So it's really important to pay attention to this in case we need to change how we're budgeting, if that difference, if they're not achieving the 7% consistently. I know it's a 5-year average, but some year there's been 0, and then you have a year that there's 11, and
Yeah, and to that point, we've seen, during the financial reports, we've talked about the police and fire returns, and we've seen it vary greatly. And we've talked about how there's different philosophies amongst the advisors. The fire side is invested in thousands of stocks through mutual funds, and the police side is more, and I think there are somewhere around 40 individual stocks, multinational companies. And both philosophies, I guess, are fairly mainstream when it comes to, other pension funds using those philosophies. But the police side, you can imagine with 40 stocks, is going to have a greater volatility, which in turn causes our required contribution to be more volatile than on the fire side where they hold thousands of stocks. So, and we've seen that bear out. I went back and looked over 15 years, just the swings in the largest increase in the required contribution versus the kind of a minimum increase in the contribution. And police was on the high side 26.1 versus the fire 22.8% increase, and then on the low side, police went down 11.8% versus fire's 3.8. So just the spread in the swing of how that impacts our required contribution is greater on the police side. Again, it's not that it's a poor investment philosophy, but we definitely need to look at, our objective isn't to out-earn the market. It's to protect against losses and keep things more stable with the long-term view. And so, and the police pension fund has discussed it a couple of times, and I know that this recent quarter they bought, the pension fund had purchased some stock mutual funds, so they are working towards, changing that up a little bit. So.
yeah, you're right. It's not to beat the market. It's to protect the money so it's there when we need it. But we don't have a tax levy, so we're absorbing these swings out of the general fund, which, then we have to make the trade-offs and the choices with other things. So I thought it was great for us to learn about this and understand it. So when we get these reports from Brian, when we read them, we'll understand them. Excellent job, Jessica. Thank you so much. Any other questions? All right, Brian, keep going.
All right, good luck following that, Brian.
I know, right?
Yeah, that was.
All right,
I thought
so
you were good explaining it. But man,
I think
that
this
was
is the first time
fantastic.
that the financial report might be less detailed than the public works report. Actually, that was fantastic. But so getting into the financial side of this, the multi-year financial forecast is obviously the first element in our kind of long-term planning, followed by the multi-year capital plan, and then the annual budget obviously is a shorter-term view. So that's kind of where that fits in. Quickly, purpose and objective of the forecast, and we've talked about this the last couple of years, so I'll move quickly through a couple slides here. It is meant to be a general long-term planning tool. It's not an absolute predictor. It's not meant to replace the budget. It's really the one time a year we get to kind of talk big picture finances instead of, what's the variance in sales tax this quarter versus last quarter. Helps establish the capital funding. Most communities will do their capital funding presentation first. That helps them establish their property tax levy. Obviously, we don't use the property tax, so we do the forecast first. That helps us set up what funding is available for our capital plan. Also confirms long-term sustainability of the funds, and it helps us identify any threats that may be out there that we need to be aware of. Answers a few key questions. Can we sustain operations long-term as they are currently? Can we adhere to the long-term capital plan that we had in place last year? Also, what is the potential impact of an economic downturn on the financials and, more importantly, the fund balance in the general fund particularly, but also in capital funds and other funds? Forecast structure didn't change. We do a 5-year look back, a 5-year look forward. We have the budget and the year-end estimate kind of in the middle. Look at major general fund revenues. That's those 8 revenues that make up about 75% of all general fund revenues. We look at those using 3 models, kind of based on the theory of economic cycles. We use a baseline, an expansion and a contraction model. We'll look a little bit more at that in a little bit here. Forecast looks at the general fund, the water and sewer fund, and debt and other capital-related funds. We did remove the 911 fund this year. Obviously, that under the new joint ETSB is under that direction. So we have, although we're represented on the board and have control of the board, we don't have anything on the forecast side that we could actually do so. Key decision points from prior year discussions. Board gave good direction on how to use debt service that's rolling off. We looked at the 2009 series and looked at 50% of that, dedicating that to capital. That's about $425,000 annually. That at this point is built into the forecast. I know when we did the first quarter report, I believe it was, or the fourth quarter report, financial report, we talked about where sales tax was, and that may need to be reduced. Not ready to make that recommendation yet. I think when we get closer into the budget and we get to see some more in-focus year-end estimates, we can take a look at that again. But I think as far as the forecast is concerned, we built it in. Also 100% of the Series 2012 that came off, $250,000, that was last year. Previous years, we looked at a multi-year water rate plan, combined annual increases. We combined the rate, implemented annual increases through fiscal year 2021. That's when the current plan expires. We did all that to keep the water and sewer capital funding in line with essentially the road program, which was funded, it now has a funding source through the home rule sales tax. Doesn't make much sense to do a road and then have to come back in a few years, tear it up, and do the water underneath. So we had to keep those kind of on an equitable basis there. That capital funding plan included a drawdown of the fund balance in the water and sewer fund, about $450,000 annually, and $300,000 transfer from the general fund to the water and sewer capital fund through 2021. 2021 is a particularly important year because that's when the rate from our water provider drops and allows us to pick that up for capital. Now, one of the things we've seen in the water and sewer fund last year was the fund had an $800,000 surplus. So when we look at the $300,000 transfer from the general to the water and sewer capital, does it make sense to put that on the general fund surplus when the water and sewer fund has an $800,000 surplus and can pay for that? So one of the things looking at recommending through this forecast period is looking first at the water and sewer surplus. If that's available and can cover the $300,000, then we won't transfer that from the general fund, or at that time make a decision. Last year we reduced it by $100,000. We only transferred $200,000 rather than $300,000 because of that surplus. But I think it just makes sense to look and see what the water and sewer fund surplus is first, and then see if we need to transfer that. Some of the threats that we see moving forward, not unique to us by any means, is personnel costs outpace revenue growth. That's common across municipalities. We're service organizations. We have personnel costs are 80% of most budgets. What is a little more unique to us is that we're not funded by property taxes, and we can't just raise the property tax to kind of even that out. Opportunities for new growth also limited. We know we're getting more and more built out, so the funds that come along with new growth will be limited moving forward in the future. We've seen the state financial issues manifest this year. 10% reduction in income tax, 2% charge on home rule sales tax collections. That combines for about a $500,000 reduction in revenue streams. And really the big question with the state is what's going to be next. what's the next revenue source that they want to take a look at and reduce or change how it's the formula, how it's distributed or something. One of the bigger long-term threats I feel we face is changing retail landscape. I think we've all heard stories about more emphasis on entertainment and eating establishments experience rather than brick and mortar kind of retail. Really, what does the taxability of that look like? Right now, it leans heavily more towards kind of the traditional retail environment. We know that's changing. What does the taxability of those transactions look like in the future? So something that we need to keep an eye on. And then finally, along with that, as the retail landscape changes, are we going to get more requests to participate financially in that changing landscape? You look at things like Portillo's. There was a request for us to participate in that. And will that become more frequent? Will those requests become more frequent? So finally, at the federal level, what impact does tax legislation or other legislation have on the local economy? We may get a sneak peek in what consumer sentiment is here when we see Black Friday, Christmas sales, things like that. But anything at the federal level can change day by day, some days hour by hour. Looking at opportunities moving forward, obviously East Grand corridor could raise the profile, ultimately revenue based of that area. Ellen's working hard, business retention, attraction. Looking at additional partners for 911 consolidation to help offset those costs. Internally looking at just processes that have an impact on operations for efficiencies. We know through some work Christine did that we have a large portion of our workforce that's eligible to retire in the next 5 years. We've talked about that a few times. Is there an opportunity there to look at some of those positions as they become vacant to see if there's opportunities to deliver those services differently, whether it be through technology, which seems to be the big thing recently, or some other means. And then finally capitalizing on obviously the Great Wolf grand opening and co-promotion of other businesses in town through that opportunity. So getting into a little more of the numbers here, just go over kind of how our projections, the baseline model, what we want to achieve here when we look at economic cycles is long-term growth trend. So that's what that model, when we forecast major revenues using that model, that's what we're looking for. The expansion model, we're looking to continue economic expansion, what the increases look like in an economic expansion period. And then on the contraction model, we want to capture what was the impact of a recession, model that for the next fiscal year, and then expansion after that. So really capturing three scenarios with major revenues and see how those impact fund balance, operations, funding. This slide just shows you major revenues, 8 major revenue sources. We forecast them all in all 3 of those models. One thing that I like to do, we did this last year for the first time, was just take a look at how the methodology kind of played out from last year to this year. We were pretty close, 175,000 off on 28 million, so it kind of validated the methodology we used to forecast some of that stuff. This chart, a couple of probably the most important charts here coming up, but this chart shows major revenue receipts starting in fiscal year 2003 on the very far left side, and then projected all the way through fiscal year 2023 using the 3 models. If you can see, the green is the expansion model, the red is the contraction model that shows the recession, and then the blue is kind of the long-term baseline model. One thing to note here is where the red circle is. We've talked about it at different financial reports, the kind of the flattening of major revenues over the last couple years, and that is apparent in this graph particularly, but also things like the Great Wolf Lodge coming online next year kind of artificially spikes just to the right of that red circle there, and then Key Lime Cove coming off brings that artificially brings that down to the left, or in the red circle a little bit. So a couple bigger changes that will impact how the graph looks, but overall it looks like flattening major revenues, and all 3 projections are right in line with where they should be based on how they're modeled. This slide just looks at the percentages. Baseline is right in line with the last 5 years at 3.1%, the expansion model 4.6%, contraction at 3.3%. Again, and you can really see it here in the fiscal year 19 projected column, the impact of call it the skew of Great Wolf coming on, that bumping up that revenue stream there. On the expenditure side, we look at salaries, property liability, workers' comp, health insurance, pensions, and debt service in detail. Looking at debt service particularly in more detail, I just like to show this slide so we know where we're at from the standpoint of debt rolling off. You can see the drop in expiring debt in 2019. That leaves only the Series 2011 or the Macy's bonds and the Park District remaining. Park District drops off in 2021, and then in 2023, the Macy's bonds drop off. One thing I did add to the forecast was a $400,000 debt service for the anticipated IEPA loan for the Knowles Road Tower, so that's included in the water and sewer forecast starting in 2020. Obviously, way more discussion to come on that when we get to the capital plan and as we start bringing those documents and approvals forward. But fund balance, this chart shows general fund balance as a percentage of the following year of expenditures. This is how we measure our fund balance against our policy. Our policy is 35%. That's represented by the black line there. And what this chart really says, I know it looks somewhat negative, but what it really says here is in a model where that is represented by the red line, where we have a recession, we make no operating adjustments, and we have no general fund surpluses, which we average about $1 million to $1.5 million a year. We still don't drop below our policy even in year 5. So this is really a really positive graph, actually. On the blue line, it stays above 45%, and then, of course, on the expansion model, we actually add to the fund balance here. So a positive, but I think it's also reflective of conservative budgeting practices and how important those are. This slide just looks at it a little bit different way. Dollar change, if you get below in the red there, that's over and above what our average surplus is, and I just used $1 million for this model. Typically it's between $1 million and $1.5 million. So we can see, obviously, in the recession model, we dip down there and then come back up, but we don't even get to, in the baseline model, we don't even get to kind of absorbing our average annual surpluses until fiscal year 2023. And again, that's making no adjustments whatsoever. In the water and sewer fund, we look at revenues based on the long-term rate plan. And we also assume and that only goes through 2021. We also assume a 2% annual drop in usage, although in fiscal year 17 we saw a 3% increase. But conservatively, we know on average over time water usage is becoming less and less as people become more efficient. Expenses, same as the general fund. We also include the Central Lake County JAWA, which is our water provider, what that expense is. And then I also included in the forecast the Knowles Road Water Tower in fiscal year 19 and 20. $2 million in fiscal year 19 and then $5 million in fiscal year 20. Obviously, more discussion to come on that when we get to the capital plan. Scott can speak better to that than I can at this point. But water and sewer capital funding, again, built in the forecast to draw down all the water and sewer fund balance to $300,000 transfer from the general fund. It'll either be transferred from the general fund or from water and sewer operating surpluses there. So, and then just a reminder, long term, when we set up the capital funding scenario, when we did the rate plan, the target for the capital funding was $2.8 million based on a 2011, I believe, Baxter and Woodman study. So that's where we got that $2.8 million number from. One of the things when we get to looking at what the capital funding looks like longer term now, JAWA has updated, right, or just increased their rate projections in 2021. We used 2021 as the marker because that was the last year of the rate model, and also when we would have, in the previous model, achieved the $2.8 million. That scenario contemplated a projected rate of $1.73. Since 2017, JAWA has increased it twice, a small increase in last year's projected, and then this year they increased the 2021 projected rate to $2.16. So that, 40 cents or whatever it is, eats into what we had planned to use for capital in our rate structure. And we see that in this slide. Capital funding, we have really four areas. Existing funding, and this came out of the rate model that set up base fees that from Baxter Woodman that started back in 2011. Last year 2 years ago when we did the rate model, we added a capital rate to the model that would capture the JAWA drop, and then using fund balance and general fund surplus. Last year's model, by 2021, we got to the 2.8 million. You can see here we fall just short of that by about 500,000. A lot of that is due to the adjustment from CLC JAWA. So still way ahead of where we were a few years ago when we were only funding about 750,000 a year, a little less than that actually. Enough to keep up with the road program through that time period, but keep an eye on what JAWA does with their projections, and we might need to make adjustments. When we get to fiscal year 2022 and 2023, I assume no increase in the rate. So there's no rate increase built in there because we don't have a rate plan out that far yet. So it's frozen at 2021 levels. Moving on to the capital fund. So this is the non-water and sewer capital fund. This would be more road, storm, sewer, vehicles, equipment type capital. On the revenue side, expiring debt service transfer of $675,000 is included. Also a $200,000 annual transfer from the impact fee fund. We've been using that primarily for stormwater management the last few years. For home rule sales tax, we use the baseline assumption. On the expense side, use the number that was in the multi-year capital plan last year. So because we want to validate that we can continue with our capital plan. And in that scenario, the fund balance remains above $2 million with those transfers. So as long as we can continue with those transfers from general fund surplus, expiring debt, we should have no problem maintaining our capital plan as it was laid out last year. Motor fuel tax fund, obviously this is dedicated to road resurfacing, about $850,000 annually. We use it strictly for roads, and the fund balance stays around $300,000. We don't mind a smaller fund balance in this fund because it's restricted and we can't use it for anything else. So in the forecast model, it stays at 300 or above throughout the forecast. And then the 911 fund, we maintain it as a pass-through, but it's under the control of the jet speed. So the biggest question really for the forecast side is, can we fund our capital plan? And so if we maintain transfers to the capital funds, as I said, barring a recession, major hit to revenues, things like that, we should be able to continue with our capital plan as was laid out last year, and it ends up around $10 million a year. You see in fiscal year 19 and 20 there, the Knowles Road dollars, $2 million in fiscal year 19 and $2 million in fiscal year 2020. So answers one of the biggest questions and moves us into the long-term capital planning portion there. And I was gonna go into a couple policy updates. Should we move that to a future meeting in interest of time here?
Yeah, the next meeting agenda is pretty light, so we'll probably just hold that till December 4th and talk about that next week. So
skip over those two guys, and then so the next steps here will be the multi-year capital plan. Take that funding, and what we learned through the forecast process, and then fit a capital plan around it that closely mirrors what we had out there 2 years out last year. Obviously, there'll be adjustments based on what's happened in the field and what Scott sees as bigger priorities, but that'll be the next step. Happy to take any questions. I didn't go into as much detail about every single assumption this year. Maybe it seems like I did.
We have this for reading material tonight.
But
excellent job. At least we know we can keep the doors open for a while longer.
We can, yes.
Questions? I think this really helps with planning where we need to be focusing our efforts or paying attention in that. So please read the rest of it. Although I still have the CAFR sitting there by my bedside to read, and I haven't finished it. I'll get to it. All right, if there's no questions, that's the end of our discussion for tonight.
no, we'll be back here Monday night again, December 4th for our next meeting. 3 Mondays in a row.
Woohoo. And then we have a few weeks off.
Yep.
So do I have a motion to adjourn? So moved. Motion by Trustee Garner, second by Trustee Balmas. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right.